No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to researcher Maryanne Spurdle about her latest column. Maryanne, good to have you back with us today, talking about your column, Even Public Schools Need Charter Schools.
Thanks, Jason.
Interesting title there. But you highlight another OECD report that's painted New Zealand as solidly middle of the pack.
Almost mediocre.
Yeah, almost mediocre. So is that concerning? Should we be concerned, or are we like, well, it's fine. We're not the worst, we're not the best, but we're content.
It's one of those where as long as we're close to average, it's like, well, we could be worse. What the survey is, a survey on drivers of trust in public institutions. And this particular question is, are you satisfied with your national education system? There are 30 countries who took the survey. 57% was the average, yes, we're satisfied. In New Zealand, 55% said, yes, we're satisfied.
So, yeah, like you say, mediocre, about half of us are happy with it.
More than half of people a good chunk are not happy. The issue is when you get into seeing which countries performed well and which didn't, and who were more like, Australians were 71% happy with their own education system, and so they're tied for fourth place there.
Wow! Behind
some of the expected ones, you've got Finland, that they were the gold medal winner. They've got 81% of Finns are happy with their education system. They've really taken ownership over the recent couple of decades. Switzerland, 76% positive. Denmark, 74%. You kind of go, they're always
the Nordic countries. That's
doing
what we
well
expect.
with education.
Yeah.
Netherlands 71%, and Australia 71%. So we're not in the same league as Australia.
Yeah, because you'd go, Nordic countries, but then Australia.
Yeah, and interestingly, what the Netherlands and Australia have in common is, in Holland, public schools and private schools are funded the same by the state.
Okay.
So if you want to send your kid to a private school, it doesn't cost you any extra. It's just independently operated. It's not quite that equitable in Australia, but both state and central government do subsidize tuition at Catholic schools and at private schools.
So is that the difference between our education system and those that are doing well? Is it the funding thing?
You've got 36% of Australian kids who are opting to go to independently operated schools, and their parents have to pay something. And actually private contributions to the education system in Australia are significant because you've got a lot of people taking school choice, but they have to pay something for it. So it's subsidizing education quite heavily. It's not fully... Like, if you can't afford any tuition fees, you do not have choice in Australia. Whereas in Holland, you do. And then in most of the Nordic countries and a few other places around the world, you have options. And so what that does is it narrows the socioeconomic gaps between, schools in high-income areas and low ones. It narrows gaps within schools because all students have equal opportunities to attend. Geography will skew who goes where and so forth. But you're basically leveling the playing field by saying your kid gets to go to school wherever you want them to go to school, as long as the school is performing up to a certain standard.
So it's more equal access to quality education.
Yeah.
And that's,
and people like that.
Yeah. And so they're happy with it. Yeah. Well, the line that I often hear is that we do have choice and access to different options of education here in New Zealand. Like, we've got all these different types of schools.
There are different categories, yes.
Yes.
With different degrees of autonomy.
Yes. So explain that to me a little bit, because I always hear, well, we've already got school choice here in New Zealand.
And on paper, we've got a good variety because you've got state integrated schools, which came out of the Catholic schools, which were not able to be self-sustaining. And so the government, rather than just absorb all those students into the state system, went, okay, well, we'll fund operations, not property and staff, but we'll fund your operations per student. And you will have to teach the curriculum, and teachers currently are under the collective pay agreement. So they've got restrictions on what they can do, but then they've got some liberty within those constraints and funding per student. You've also got designated character schools. They only serve 1% of the population. On paper, they can teach their own curriculum. They don't have the same liberty that private schools have over employment issues. They also have the very rigid pay structure where you can't pay a teacher more than a certain amount or less than a certain amount or a different amount just because they're a good teacher. Like, you don't have that control, and you are still under the Ministry of Education. So those schools can have special character. They're fully funded, including property. So it's kind of a hybrid. The thing is, the Ministry of Education has to approve designated character schools.
Yeah.
And so far, there are only 52 of them operating. 9 of those were concessions to former charter schools from a decade ago. And the majority of students are Maori students. They're doing excellent work in the area they're doing it in, but only a select few schools have been allowed that. So yes, on paper, we do have some liberty for schools to operate under a special character and be fully funded, but they do have limitations, and very few schools are approved.
And they're only serving 1% of the students. So on paper, yes, we have abundant choice. In reality,
Practice, who actually has one in their neighborhood?
Yeah.
And unless you're going to a Maori language school, it's very unlikely there's any school that's
1 in 100 students.
Yeah. And I know schools that have been declined an application because they are deemed too similar to. So you've got the online learning in the state system. Any online educator who's providing distance learning is immediately disqualified because that already exists in the state system, even if it's a completely different model of providing that.
Different curriculum, different
anything,
whatever. It's like, oh, we already do that.
Exactly,
so
we do it.
We've already got that option.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So it's not actually, And then you've got access to schools is another issue. So state integrated, there are fees. Private schools, there are fees. So a lot of the options that exist are not actually available to people who don't have a fair amount of disposable income.
So you also mention in the column that returning because the other thing that I hear is this is terrible for public schools. If we open up private schools, it's terrible. But you make the point here that returning schools to the communities and to the iwi actually will help public schools. I mean, that's the title of your column. Even public schools need charter schools. So
well, I mean, look at the problems that the public schools are facing. About 20% are oversubscribed. They don't have enough classroom space for the students who are rightfully enrolled for being in zone.
Yeah, because the rule is they have to take the students that are in zone.
Exactly.
And they can't refuse.
And they have to wait on the Ministry of Education to approve building projects and
bureaucracy.
There have been many stories recently about building projects and the angst around that. So it's not so simple to achieve. For those, 1/5 of schools who are oversubscribed and the many others who are probably near max, they would actually have a better time of it if 4, 5, 6% of their students found another option that they preferred and freed up classroom space. And freed up teachers. The other huge crisis in schools at the moment, especially secondary schools, is they are having a massive problem, and it's just getting worse and worse, finding and retaining teachers. And even when they do employ someone, currently in secondary schools, 7% of positions are filled by teachers with a limited authority to teach, so they're not fully qualified. 30% of secondary schools have cancelled or transferred courses to distance learning because of a lack of qualified teachers. And there are appointments being made to jobs for which there were no suitable applicants. A significant number of principals are finding 0 or only 1 applicant for the majority of the roles they're advertising. So that means they don't have capacity, even if they've got the classroom space, to teach the number of students they have. The reason that independently operated schools will help because, theoretically, you've got the same number of teachers, same number of students. They're just shuffled around in different schools. Independent schools will be allowed, our charter schools will be allowed to hire a certain percentage of their staff on a limited authority to teach, not in a short-term capacity, but we think that you're qualified to do this job, even though you don't have technically the teaching credentials that you'd have to teach in the public school system.
So as an example, like say a builder could teach woodworking at a secondary school, even if he doesn't have a teaching postgraduate diploma in teaching.
Yeah, if the school determines, because at the moment public schools are employing people in non-specialty areas, left and right, recruiting from overseas, people who aren't familiar with the system here, doing all sorts of things that are not ideal. So for an independently operated school to evaluate someone and say, we think you're going to be able to, it's definitely not worse than what's already going on in the current public school system. The other thing that they'll be able to do is they won't have a cap. There will be constraints on what they can pay because money isn't infinite. Yeah,
it doesn't grow on trees,
But they won't be strictly limited to the pay scale that public schools are. And so instead of having a cap at about $105,000 a year, if they see somebody who they think $120,000 a year is a fair salary for someone with their expertise and they can recruit them from outside the teaching profession, from industries that pay more, that will add teachers into the system that don't exist now. And that'll make it easier for public schools who are having trouble finding teachers. They'll have fewer students and there'll be more teachers in the system. So theoretically anyway, this could help solve public school problems. The idea that it's going to exacerbate them by taking away money is extremely simplistic because you only lose per student funding as you lose a student. And if you lose that student,
maybe you don't need
you don't need a teacher for them. You're not paying the teacher for them, and their classrooms are already maxed out. So it's not like there are going to be, masses of empty classrooms sitting around. Yeah. There might be in the odd school, but that is not a problem we're worried about.
So, Maryanne, the bottom line is charter schools, good for students, good for teachers, good for parents, good for everyone.
Yeah. And there's an if. They need to be held accountable and there's legislation for that. They need to be able to get access to good teachers, which is a challenge, but they are more able than other schools to do that. There are ifs, but the model will make it more likely that those things will happen, not less likely.
Well, Maryanne, I look forward to checking in with you as we see the legislation come in and seeing how it goes and seeing what you're doing in this space as we go forward. Thanks for
Jason.
being with us.
Yet another OECD report has painted New Zealand as solidly average. This year's survey on drivers of trust in public institutions asked people if they are satisfied with their national education system. Across 30 countries, an average of 57% of respondents are. 55% of Kiwis said yes. But get this, 71% of Aussies responded positively. Are our neighbours less fussy, or is their education system that different? What do they have in common with high satisfaction countries that we don't? Finland topped the list with 81% satisfied. Switzerland and Denmark both 76% and 74% respectively. All have decentralized education systems where regions manage operations. In Denmark, municipalities also fund schools up to lower secondary level. Upper secondary schools are centrally funded and self-governing. In the Netherlands, 71% are satisfied. Both public and private schools are funded equally by the state, and funding depends on outcomes. Fancy that. People are happiest when they have access to autonomous, fully funded schools that are held accountable. In Australia, 36% of students attend private and Catholic schools that are heavily subsidized by state and central governments. That sounds like an expensive option until you factor in the contributions that millions of people make in return for school choice. In New South Wales alone, 2.2 billion Australian dollars a year comes from private sources. Next time someone insists that only the Ministry of Education can improve education, remember this. Parents are more satisfied with schools when educators and communities have more say than bureaucrats, unions, and politicians. And providing meaningful school choice always serves students better. Here in New Zealand, some still believe that the introduction of charter schools will devastate public schools. In fact, returning some schools to communities and iwi is exactly what public education needs. Why? Because more than 500 state schools are over capacity, a massive problem that new charter schools will ease. And because in secondary schools, 27% of vacant teaching positions are going unfilled, and a growing number of teachers leave the profession mid-career. Independent schools, however, can recruit more broadly and have more liberty to create appealing working conditions. All teachers benefit when there are enough of them to go around. And tragically, because 1/3 of 15-year-olds struggle to read and write. This is not because they can't learn. It's because they haven't had access to the type of education they need. Rather than worry about publicly funding private operators, which we happily do with services from GP clinics to emergency housing providers, let's be afraid of imitating Greece. Its centralized education system spends no public funds on independent schools, and it was the least popular in the OECD report. 37% of Greeks are satisfied, 47% are dissatisfied. Most OECD countries now provide the majority of independent schools' income, one way or another. This doesn't just reduce socioeconomic gaps in schools, it reflects what parents want. And for their children's sake, I'm looking forward to the day New Zealand joins them.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.